Hello and welcome to the Embodying Philosophy podcast. My name is Floss and I'm your host, a scholar practitioner, yoga teacher and geek for all things embodied philosophy. In modern times, we all too often think of philosophy as abstract ideas irrelevant to how we live our lives. But in ancient and pre-modern times, philosophy was a way of life. This podcast seeks to explore and revive this understanding of philosophy as a way of life, embodying philosophy as the practice of meaningful inquiry in relation to our lives as they are lived today in a pluralistic and diverse world, through engagement with ideas, practices, and traditions across time and space, from yoga to Christianity and beyond. Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Embodying Philosophy podcast. My name is Floss and today we're talking about freedom.
So freedom is central to pretty much all spiritual, religious and philosophical traditions. However, they have a slightly different understanding of freedom. But freedom is particularly important for yoga. So in yoga, which is both a practice and a goal, the goal is freedom. According to yoga, the freedom that we possess as humans, the freedom of free will, our ability, arguably unlike other animals, to observe, reflect, make decisions, make action in the world, deliberate. According to yoga, this is not true freedom. This is still a form of illusion. So, what might help us in thinking about freedom in yoga and liberation to begin with is a little bit of historical background, a little bit of historical context. And I always love explaining this, the development from the Vedic religion towards the development of yoga, because I think it's just so fascinating. And we might describe it as a dialectic, but that's for another day. So essentially, prior to 1500 BCE, the Vedic religion proliferated in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the Vedic religion was concerned with a fire ritual, a fire sacrifice. This is called the yagna. And essentially, the Brahminical class, so the priestly class, would conduct this religious sacrifice, this religious ritual, which involved putting offerings in the fire and also reciting mantra, reciting hymns. And we find these in the Vedas, some of the oldest religious texts in the world, which were composed or at least written in around 1500 BCE, but would have been orally transmitted for much longer prior. Now, when they were orally transmitted, this was through the priestly class. It was a very tight-knit tradition in the sense of passing on the tradition, passing on the practice through the classes, through what came to be the castes. Now, cosmologically, that's if we're thinking of a greater vision of the cosmos, the universe, the world, and ourselves, humans within it. Within the Vedic religion, there was an understanding of an imminent risk of chaos, an imminent risk of chaos. And this idea that there was a fine line between the universe being peaceful and continuing in a safe way and utter chaos coming onto the world. And there was a sense in this way that the fire sacrifice actually pleased the gods and helped maintain the balance of the cosmos. So offering the sacrifice into the fire kept the sun rising each morning and the moon setting each evening. Now, around 800 BCE, we find some new developments in the Indian subcontinent. And these see a big change in the understanding of both the sacrifice and the goals of religion, of spirituality. So one scholar, whose name does escape me at this moment, describes this context as that of ascetic soup. Now, what is ascetic or asceticism? So asceticism is an approach to religion, practice, and the world, and ultimately the self, which is self-denying. It's concerned with rejecting the material world, the vastly social world, in order to retreat, in order to go inside, to live a sparse life, often to put harm up, or what seems like harm, upon oneself through really rigorous and vigorous practices. So around 800 BCE, within this context, we begin to get a new culture of asceticism emerge. And essentially what this means is that individuals, as far as we're aware, men, but surely women as well, started rejecting the stratification, organization, and goals of the Vedic culture in order to go into the forests, leave society, and pursue a different kind of ritual, a different kind of fire. While the Vedic religion was concerned with the outer fire sacrifice, the new ascetic culture was concerned with bringing the fire inside, the internal fire. And if you're familiar with the yogic concept of tapas, one of the 8 limbs of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, you will know that tapas represents this inner heat, this inner fire, this discipline that we cultivate in order to go beyond our current state. So essentially, in this context, individuals would leave society and begin to pursue not only a practice of ascetic discipline, but also new goals. And new goals began to emerge, a new vision of the cosmos and the solution to this understanding. So I can read some quotes from the Upanishads, which began to be composed from 800 BCE onwards, approximately. And essentially, the Upanishads, by their name, Upanishad, means something along the lines of, in Sanskrit, under the feet of the guru. So even etymologically, that is in the form of the language and of the word. The move from the Vedas, which were hymns, instructions for this ritual run by the Brahmanical class, to Upanishad, which were considered the end of the Vedas as well, the completion of the Vedas, the highest thought of the Vedas, but also this idea of sitting at the foot of the teacher, of the ascetic. So the Chandogya Upanishad 8.13.1 states, shaking off evil like a horse its hair and freeing myself like the moon from Rahu's jaws, I, the perfected self, the Atman, cast off the body, the imperfect, and attain the world of Brahman. I, the perfected self, the Atman, cast off the body, the imperfect, and attain the world of Brahman. So what it's worth noting here is a few concepts, especially at the second half of that quote, of that verse. The perfected self, the Atman, this reflects a new idea of the self, the soul, as divine. The Atman, it comes to be understood as the individual soul. And as it goes on, casting off the body, the imperfect, here's this sense of ascetic value or disvalue of the body, of the material, in favor of that which is beyond it, the spiritual, the transcendent. And it's really interesting that in the early development of yoga, from the Upanishads to including Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which came at least 400 years later, there is a sense of body rejection. And this has a big contrast with modern yoga, which is very body affirming. It's very pro body, pro physicality, pro materiality. Whereas at this time, it was actually rejecting the body in favor of going beyond the body. And then the quote goes, and attaining the world of Brahman. Now, Brahman is understood as the universal, as God, as the being and absolute. And there's a sense that the Atman is related to the Brahman, the individual soul, and the universal soul. And the purpose of the practice is to pursue and realize Brahman. I'm going to share another quote from the Shvetasvara Upanishad 2.15. And it says, it goes, when by means of the true nature of the self, which resembles a lamp, a man or woman practicing yogic restraint sees here the true nature of Brahman. He or she is freed from all fetters because they have known God, unborn, unchanging, and unsullied by all objects. When by means of the true nature of the self, which resembles a lamp, a man or woman practicing yogic restraint sees here the true nature of Brahman. He or she is freed from all fetters because he has known God, unchanging, unborn, and unsullied by all objects. So I love here this image of the self, the Atman, which resembles a lamp, this idea of light of the soul. And practicing yoga, yogic restraint, asceticism, this idea of discipline, tapas. One comes to see the true nature of Brahman, which is at once deeply related to the Atman, the self, and that is freedom. So knowledge is freedom, not knowledge in and of the world, but this knowledge of Brahman, of God. And that is freedom, enlightenment, liberation. Because to know the true nature of Brahman is also to know God, unborn, unchanging, and unsullied by all objects. Now, it's important to remember that these ideas are very, very old, over 2,500 years old, over 2,500 years old. And they were very much contextually situated. While the claims are somewhat universal claims about the nature of reality, the Brahman and the Atman, ultimately they are deeply situated in time and space, socially, historically situated. And it's important to remember this when we think about yoga. Often there's this desire to return to the authentic yoga. I mean, I very much experienced this. I did my teacher training over 5 years ago in India, the most authentic one I could find, seeking the true yoga. And through my studies, I've discovered that yoga as a tradition has changed and continues to change. It looked different 2,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago. It continues to change. There's no one yoga, there's many yogas. And actually, as with any tradition, I would argue religious, spiritual, it's our role as participants in this tradition, an ongoing tradition, to continue to find the meaning within our own lives and within our own context. So that's just a point of note that I'm very passionate about. So I just want to add one more thing before we move on to talk a little bit more about other religious, spiritual, and philosophical traditions. And this is just to outline some of the other concepts which began to emerge as we move from the Vedic religion to the Upanishads, to the early forms of yoga. So these include concepts such as moksha, samadhi, murti. These are all forms of liberation, forms of goals of yoga. Samadhi being the final of Patanjali's limbs, Patanjali's 8 limbs. But we also get Buddhism and Jainism, two other ascetic-ish religions emerging in this time with their own soteriological or salvational goals, liberation, nirvana, within this context of ascetic soup. Now, I do admit that these ideas of enlightenment and freedom can feel very lofty, very, highbrow, and very far removed from modern life. And as I stressed before, it's our responsibility to understand and consider and reflect on these concepts within our own lives, within our own lives. So even within the earlier periods, and I'll do another lecture, talk, podcast on this for sure, but we have stratifications of life stage. And it's only the final life stage where one pursues these goals. The earlier life stages, the householder, the student, they are concerned with more worldly goals, worldly values. And my point to mention this, the ashramas, which means house, the ashramas, the life stages. My reason to mention this is to show that even at this period, we're talking 800 BCE, these ideas of yoga were not for everyone in the same way. And over time, we understand how yoga is reworked and reconsidered for different people at different stages of their life in different ways. Moving on. So, while there are many interpretations of freedom and yogic freedom, ultimately it stresses the coming forth of truth, of a true self. But it's really interesting, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that other traditions talk about freedom too. For Paul and the early Christians, freedom is what we have. Christ has set us free. And that's a quote from Letter to the Galatians 5.1. I'll just repeat that. Freedom is what we have. Christ has set us free. This idea that the Jewish law, which preceded early Christianity, was not true freedom, and that true freedom came through Christ, through faith, through belief, not through the law, but the Spirit, the Word, the New Testament. Similarly, the European Enlightenment, which while ultimately was secularizing, it wouldn't say it was necessarily religious, although arguably at the beginning it was, is itself a form of ideology, religion, we could say. And this is because it has its own values, which are quasi-religious, ideas of salvation, of the highest goals of human life. And these are of the ability of human reason to free us from the shackles of illusion, the shackles of superstition. Now, the European Enlightenment, the values of human progress that it promoted, have ultimately failed. And this is really interesting because while we have this suggestion that secularism, atheism, the decline of religion is inevitable in modernity, actually it's no longer really the case. More people are becoming religious, especially in other parts of the world, but also people are increasingly interested in religion, spirituality, philosophy. They crave meaning against the emptiness, the nihilism, the nothingness, which we often end up with when we rely too much on human ability to find truth ourselves and our ability to do everything ourselves. The Enlightenment ultimately wanted to free human reason from the shackles of superstition. And in this way, while it may have begun by being pro-religious in the sense that it saw the supernatural is separate from the natural, and then it felt that human reason could study the natural and come to know it as God's creation. Ultimately, the supernatural began to decline and was seen as irrational. But ultimately, what was discovered, and I think many people feel this today, is that the highest values, humans cannot be arbiters of themselves. I mean, we can have ideals we believe in, but true freedom, we might say, is beyond human grasping, human completeness. And this is where we might argue that or suggest that grace comes in, the divine God. So I think what these examples so far tell us is that humans are undeniably free. We have, as I've mentioned, the ability to reflect on the past in relation to the future, the freedom to act and deliberate in a way that other animals do not, this capacity for self-reflection. But freedom is complicated and not uncontested. We are not atomized individuals with absolute freedom and free will. Rather, we live in society and are constrained to an extent by society and the others who are part of it. The needs and desires of others, humans, animals, institutions, nations. And we also have responsibility for others. In other words, our freedom in this world is not absolute individual freedom, but must be executed and deliberated in dialogue with other humans. At the same time, the yogic tradition and also the Christian tradition teaches us that our understanding of freedom in this life might be flawed, that this is not true freedom, and that actually liberation, freedom of another kind is the goal of our lives, but not in the way that we might initially think. This is a salvational or soteriological understanding of freedom, of liberation. Now, while for the yogic tradition, and I've got another quote here from the Shvetashvara Upanishad, the self, the Atman, remains bound because he is the enjoyer. There's this idea of attachment and the fact that attachment to our desires, to things in the world, actually keeps us bounded and keeps us unfree. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the yogic ascetic culture and understandings of freedom are quite removed from our modern lives. They can lead us to feel quite guilty for being enjoyers, for having attachments to the world. But actually, as most of us are householders, attachment is really healthy. Having social bonds, community is a good thing. It gives us meaning and stability. And too often, I find the values of spiritual liberation that are perpetuated within modern spiritual circles, including that of yoga today, actually they can map on very well to neoliberal, capitalistic values of globalized late modernity. In other words, the capitalistic consumerist world we live in proliferated as well via technology and social media. This actually promotes individualism. And this kind of individualism maps really well onto this idea of individual liberation, spiritual freedom. And often it can lead to spiritual bypassing or even spiritual narcissism. So in this way, I'm sometimes quite skeptical of promoting the value of freedom within yoga, of enlightenment, because ultimately, and this might get a bit technical now, but we are not enlightened as we are living in a dual world. Our ability to talk about enlightenment as this ideal, this object, means that we are not enlightened. So what are we to do? Well, while yoga, as I'm emphasizing, as practiced by ascetics, may be concerned with liberation from this world, we can also think about freedom in other ways, freedom while remaining in the world, as opposed to rejecting the world, as early yoga did, and rejecting the body as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are free, but we are also constrained. We are free, but we are also constrained. And we might begin to think about our freedom in the world, the way we act, and more importantly, the way we react, because our action is never isolated, it's always in these webs of relationality with others. We might begin to reflect on how we act and react through the prism of freedom. So, for example, if we feel that we're very reactive in the world, that we get angry easily or snap, yoga and embodied practice, meditation, contemplation, pausing, getting in touch with ourselves is a way to begin to look in and find that space between the actions, that pause, that inaction, before we act again. And as we begin to purify or refine our inner sensibilities, when we take that time out of the world, a mini kind of ascetic practice of leaving the world, going inside, we can come back out into the world freer to express ourselves. That light, that lamp that our earlier Upanishadic quote mentioned, the self which resembles a lamp, it can shine more freely, more authentically, more expressively. And in doing so, we can begin to be formed in relation to that which is beyond ourselves. We might call this Brahman, we might call this God, we might call this truth, we might call this beauty, we might call this something else, the universe, goodness, God. But we can begin to be formed in dialogue, in relation, because the lamp within us, the light, is orientated, our freedom is orientated towards goodness, towards God. And in doing so, we can become free. As Paul said, freedom is what we have. Christ has set us free. Belief for Paul and the early Christians in Christ as Savior, and how that belief transforms, orientating ourselves towards God. So in this way, we can think about freedom while being in this world through contemplative inward-facing practice, which isn't necessarily hardcore asceticism rejecting this world, but a practice of going inwards in order to go out. We can become freer, not rejecting the world, but while in the world. And as we begin to close this talk and bring this talk to an end, I want to share another quote from the Shvetashvara Upanishad, which introduces a new concept of love or bhakti. And this is actually the first, the earliest reference of bhakti in the whole yogic Indic Hindu corpus. So it states 6.23, only in a man who has the deepest love for God and who shows the same love towards his teacher as towards God, do these points declared by the Noble One shine forth. Only in a man or woman who has the deepest love for God and who shows the same love towards his teacher as towards God, do these points declared by the Noble One shine forth. These points about freedom. In other words, this freedom is not empty. It's not just about ourself and action, but it's about love. It's about orientation. God is love. So I think we'll close there for now. Next time we'll be talking about silence. And I hope you've enjoyed this talk, this first of, I hope, many. And I'll see you soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for listening to episode 1 of the Embodying Philosophy podcast. Stay tuned, and I'll see you soon for episode 2. Bye-bye.